So welcome everyone to this webinar where we are going to talk about what's new in Angular 7. So first, I want to apologize for the slight delay in getting started. We had some technical issues to get the webinar up and running, but we are now all set. So I'm going to get things started, and let's dive into it right away and see what is new in Angular 7. So this webinar is going to be about the updates that got released with Angular version 7. And something important to know about is that after this presentation, you are going to be able to ask questions. We are going to do a quick Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to stay at the end of the webinar and you'll be able to ask me all of these different questions. So before I get started, just a few words about myself. My name is Alan Chotard, or just Al, and I'm a Google developer expert in web technologies, more specifically Angular. My background is as a full stack developer since 2006, and in 2011 I got started with Angular.js, and since then I've been basically playing and building web applications for Angular.js and with Angular later on a daily basis. So I live in Sacramento, California, where I am the organizer of the Sacramento Angular meetup group. And what I do for a living is that I help development teams get started and learn Angular, the Angular framework. So I do consulting about 60% of the time and technical training 40% of the time for companies like Accelebrate, who is the organizer of this webinar. I also blog at blog.angulartraining.com, where I post some tutorials about twice a month. So now let's get started with Angular itself. And the first thing I want to go through is a little bit of Angular history, because this helps clarify how the Angular team works and how Angular gets released these days. So Angular.js started in 2012, and version 1.0 was released back then, about in the middle of 2012. And then, as you can see, during the Angular.js area, so Angular.js is the name for Angular 1.x. All of the version 1s are now known as Angular.js. And the lifespan for that version was really from 2012 to about 2016, when Angular 2, which is known as just Angular these days, was released. And during that Angular.js era from 2012 to 2016, the release schedule was not really known or shared with anyone, and we would get releases from time to time. As you can see in the timeline, sometimes you would get a lot of releases within a short time frame. So we had 3 different releases of Angular.js in 2012, and then just one in 2013, and nothing in 2014, and then one more in 2015, one more in 2016. So the thing with that is that we didn't have any idea of when something new would come up with Angular.js. And the other thing is that we would get breaking changes with all of these different versions. So from a user perspective, from a developer perspective, it was not easy to work with Angular.js because of that. We didn't know when new code would be released, and when it would be released, then we would have issues integrating it, and we would have to change our code quite a lot. So that was not very convenient, but the Angular team learned from that. And in the new era of Angular 2+, just known as Angular, so that's since the second half of 2016, now the Angular team decided to have a very predictable schedule. And the way they do it is that there is now a new major version every 6 months. So Angular 2 was released mid-2016, and then 6 months later we got Angular 4, So they didn't do any Angular 3 because, well, they had the Angular router, which is a package of Angular itself, had to be changed quite a bunch between Angular 2 and Angular 4, and this specific router already had a version 3. So what they did is that they decided to have all of the packages at the same version number, and they increased from 2 to 4. So it just the reason why we don't have any Angular 3 in the history, but still the major version number was increased 6 months later, and 6 months after Angular 4 we got Angular 5, and about 6 months later Angular 6 and Angular 7, which happened a couple of weeks ago. So this is good to know because now we have a clear, predictable schedule. We know that every 6 months we get a new major version of the Angular framework, and that is the only time when we could have breaking changes with the framework. So we now know that Angular 8 is going to be the next version, and it's going to be 6 months from now. So that's probably going to be around April or May or 2019. So the schedule is not precise to the day. Sometimes it takes a few extra weeks for the Angular team to actually release that feature, that major version. But for the most part, so far as you can tell, they have been quite predictable, and they followed their predicted schedule as they announced it. So another thing that is important to know about the Angular framework and the way versioning works is that, as I just mentioned, major versions are released every 6 months. So that's when the major version number increases. So all of the Angular versions follow semantic versioning, which means we have a 3-digit version number, and the major version, which is the first digit, the X in that version number, is the one that's going to increase every 6 months. And once that new version is released, so for instance, in the case of Angular 7, then the major version is released and is supported for its initial 6 months lifetime. And then what the Angular team is going to do is still keep supporting it for 1 more year after this initial 6 months time frame. So overall, Angular 7 is going to have a lifespan of 1.5 years. And after that 1.5 years, the Angular team is not going to give you any more bug fixes or any minor versions for Angular 7, and you would have to upgrade to the latest version of Angular, which at that point would be Angular 10. 1.5 years from now. So that's how things work. So you don't have to upgrade every 6 months to the latest version of Angular, but that is really what the Angular team wants us to do, because well, it's just easier to upgrade small step by small step than waiting for 1 year or 2 years and then have a complex upgrade process in place in order to do that. So that's major versions. They happen every 6 months, and we get a 1.5 years support for all of them. Then the next thing about Angular versioning is that we also have minor versions. So that's the Y, the middle digit in the version numbers. And these versions happen once a month maximum. Usually, same thing, the Angular team is pretty good with that schedule, and they would only release a minor version if needed. And what's actually interesting is that in Angular history so far, most of the very interesting features have been released with minor versions instead of major versions. And that's because these minor versions, they release them whenever they have something new that doesn't have any breaking change. So if the minor version has an interesting new feature that is optional, that won't break your code because, well, you would have to actually use it in order to have it come into play. So as a result, these minor versions don't break anything, and that's sometimes where we get the most interesting features. And version 7.1 is already in beta and will be released very soon as well. And finally, we have patch versions. So patch versions are the final digit in the Angular versioning. And what these patch versions are is that they are bug fixes, basically. So they could be released up to once a week if needed. And we get them from time to time, not every week, of course, but because there's not that many bugs in the Angular framework. But still, it's very frequent that we would get an increase in the final digit here. So the best practice is really to get all of these patch releases and minor versions as they get released, because it is free of any surprise, I would say. It's just bug fixes and improvements and new features. So you can upgrade to these minor versions and patch releases without having to change your code. And major versions every 6 months. There could be some breaking changes, but so far the Angular team has been very, very good with that and made sure that all of these new versions didn't break much of our code. And as we're going to see in a few minutes, there is also automated tools now in the Angular framework to automatically upgrade without us having to write any code. So that's even better. So now that we know about Angular versioning and how we got there and why these versions keep increasing very quickly, I want to mention a bunch of partner projects. And the reason for that is because most of the new features that we get in Angular these days actually happen through these partner projects. So there are projects that are not always maintained by the Angular team, but by the open source community around the Angular framework. So some examples of such projects are the Angular CLI. So this one is maintained by the Angular team, but others are Angular Material, Angular Fire, and NX that comes from a different company. And there are projects that try to get in sync with the Angular release schedule, which is very convenient because when we get to Angular 7, for instance, what happens is that Angular Material release its version 7, NX release version 7, Angular Fire same thing, and Angular CLI as well. So we can just upgrade all of these projects along with our main Angular application, and that's great because then all of the dependencies are just on the same schedule as well, which is which allows us to not have to wait for these dependencies to get updated, but we can really upgrade to Angular 7 pretty much as soon as it is released. So this brings us to Angular 7 itself. And the reason why I mentioned these partner projects is because most of the new features of Angular 7, they actually come from these projects and not from the framework itself. Very few things have changed in Angular 7 compared to Angular 6. And that's because the focus of the Angular team with Angular on all of these major versions is really performance improvements. So making things faster, making sure that our builds with Angular are smaller than ever so that when we deploy our code to production, it is fast, it works great, and we don't have any security issues. So that's really the focus of the Angular team. That's really been there for quite a while now. Since the release of Angular 2, they've been focusing on improving the framework in terms of performance for the most part. As a result, Angular 7 is the most performant and the safest version of the framework to date. So if you are currently using Angular 5 or Angular 6 or Angular 4, you are missing out in terms of performance. And when you're going to upgrade to Angular 7, you're going to get a much better application. It's going to be faster, it's going to be smaller, it's going to be a better experience for your users. And the good news is that you won't have to change a lot of code in order to get all of these benefits because, again, the Angular team is trying to make this as easy and as painless as possible for us to upgrade. So the good news with Angular 7 is that there's no real breaking change in the Angular framework, so upgrading is fairly easy. You can pretty much just tell your package.json to get the latest version of Angular and use it, and all of your Angular code is going to be fine. So what's new in Angular 7? The first new feature that we get is actually with Angular CLI, and that feature with Angular CLI is prompts. So if you're familiar with Angular, you know that when we create new things, for instance, when we create a new project or when we generate a component with Angular CLI, then we sometimes have to pass some options to the command line tool in order to behave the way we expect it to be. And what they did with version 7 is that they made our life a little bit easier, because now we don't even have to remember these options. The tool is going to ask us with prompts. So that's what you can see on the screen right now. What's happening is that I'm trying to generate a new project, so ng new my project, and as soon as I do this, Angular is going to ask me, hey, do you want to have routing in this project, and what style sheet format do you want to use? Is it going to be CSS or less or Sass, and all of that. So this is very helpful because, well, it's interactive, it's prompting us, and this also allows us to discover some of these options that sometimes we didn't even know about because they were kind of hidden as options in Angular CLI. So that's prompts, and that's a new feature in Angular CLI 7. A new feature that was actually there before Angular 7, but what they did with Angular 7 is that they added default values for that in Angular.json is the notion of budgets. And what budgets are is they are a way to warn us or even to make a build fail if we are getting some dependencies in our code that are way too big. So that's a way to keep the size of our web application under control. And when we use budgets, so in version 7 of Angular, that's the default config that we have. The build would fail if the maximum size of it is more than 5 megabytes. And that's a great feature to have, because let's think about this. You have a company, you have a developer working on an application. The application has been in production for a while, it is performant, and somehow one day a developer adds a new dependency to it because they need a new library and just add it to the project. They don't realize that this library is huge and it's going to have a big impact on your application. Then thanks to the budgets feature, the build would fail and tell you, oh, wait a minute, the build is way too big now. There's something wrong. Check what just happened, because we are now way over 5 megabytes of output when we build our Angular app. So there is also a warning threshold, which by default is set to 2 megabytes. And of course, this can be tweaked. You can change those values in angular.json. If you look for budgets in that file, you'll be able to see that or even add them, tweak them, so that they fit your own needs in terms of size constraints. So you can increase those budgets if you want them to be 10 megabytes instead of 5 for the maximum. You can definitely do that easily with angular.json. And again, these budgets are going to be enforced by Angular CLI itself when you run those builds. The next new tool that we are getting with Angular 7, this one was actually released a couple of months ago before Angular 7, and it is the Angular console. And what the Angular console is, it is a user interface for Angular CLI. So this is even better than the prompts or than Angular CLI itself, because it's giving us a nice user interface to manage our projects with Angular CLI. So we can just click buttons on the Angular console to basically show us all of the different options that we have and run these commands directly from the console. So you can run the unit tests for your code right from the console, serve your project for dev purposes, or use all of the commands to generate a new component or a new service, and all of that. So that's a very good feature, very interesting. It works great, and it's good for beginners, basically, because if you're new to Angular, you'll be able to discover all of these features, all of these things that Angular CLI can do from a simple user interface. And it's also great for experts or people who have more experience with Angular, because then you don't have to remember all of these different options for Angular CLI. You can just rely on Angular console to know about this and do the job for you of remembering that. Plus, from time to time, some options get added, some get renamed, so you don't have to worry about it. If you use Angular console, the tool is going to know that all of that for you. So Angular console can be downloaded on the internet fairly easily. It's an independent application that relies on Angular CLI, and yeah, it works. They have versions for Windows, they have versions for macOS, and I believe they have a beta version for Linux as well, but it's not fully released yet. It's just a beta version for Linux. But if you're using macOS or Windows, you can definitely go ahead and check out the Angular console. So now, in terms of coding itself, we get one of the partner projects that the Angular team is closely working with is called the Angular Component Development Kit. And this Angular Component Development Kit, or CDK, actually came about from the Angular Material team. So if you're not familiar with Angular Material, it is a user interface, a UI library for Angular, and it is developed by Google as well, but it's a different team than the team working on the Angular framework. And Angular Material builds a lot of components for the Angular framework. So if you want to use, let's say, a date picker or tabs or any of the most common user interface components, they do have that in the CDK, in Angular Material. And as they build these components for Angular Material, what the Material team realized is that there is a lot of common behaviors that we need when we build a web application with Angular. So for instance, having a pop-up window or a layer that shows up on top of everything else on our screens, or tabs, or the ability to display a component in a different section of our screen. All of these things that rely some advanced JavaScript and DOM manipulation. What they decided to do with it is that they created a component development kit that has all of these different features and behaviors in one place that we can use through a set of directives, components, and services. So the good news about the CDK is that you don't have to use Angular Material in order to get it. It is an independent project. So you can just decide to include the CDK in your app, and then you would have access to all of these directives and services and components that would make your workflow in developing components much easier. So with Angular 7 and the CDK version 7, there's two major things that were added to the CDK. And the first one that you can see on the screen right now is drag and drop support. So drag and drop is something we see more and more in web applications. It is a very common thing to do. And with the CDK, as you can see, it's very easy. We can just use two different directives. So CDK drop list and CDK drag. So CDK drop list is the area where we can do drag and drop. So that's the main container where we have the drag and drop feature. So in the case of my example here, that would be this big rectangle where we have all of the cards showing up. And then inside that area, we just display a lot of cards. We repeat, we use ng4 to iterate and create all of these different cards. And as long as they have the CDK drag directive, then that's all we have to do in terms of code. We just put these two directives on our elements, and then you have the behavior that you can see up here in the animation, where cards can be dragged and dropped and automatically reorganize on the screen. So that's great tooling, because if we had to code this ourselves in JavaScript and create our own directives for that, it would be a lot of work. It would be difficult. And now we get that through the Angular CDK for free, which is great. Another feature that was released with the CDK is virtual scroll. So just like drag and drop, virtual scroll is one of these features that is more and more popular. And in the example here, you can see that we are scrolling down a list of images, and we always only have 4 or 5 different images that show up in the HTML at any given time. So that's what the virtual scroll feature does. And in order to use it, we just specify that we have a CDK virtual scroll viewport, which is really this area of the screen where we can scroll down. And inside that viewport, we use the CDK virtual for, which is a loop that's going to iterate through all of our images. And as you can see up here on the viewport, we specify that the item size that we want is 4. And this tells the CDK that at any given time, when we are scrolling through the list, we only want to have 4 images that get loaded. And then as you scroll down, the CDK is automatically going to go through your list of all of the images that you have and get either increase or decrease the indexes of the 4 current images that are loaded on the screen. So again, that's a very nice feature that we get, very little code. As you can see, I can just use that example here, and I have a virtual scroll up and running. So that's, again, a nice feature that was added to the component CDK. So that's really most of the new features that we got with Angular 7. So the Angular console, the Angular CLI prompts, these new partner launches where the CDK has drag and drop feature and a virtual scroll. If you want to upgrade to Angular 7, it is fairly straightforward. You can just go to this website, update.angular.io, which is updated by the Angular team itself. And from there, when you get to that web page, it's going to ask you your current Angular version and the one you want to upgrade to. And then you can specify your app complexity. Is it basic, medium, or advanced? If you're using some external libraries in your project, and then you can click the button, show me how to update, and it's going to highlight everything you would have to do step by step in order to get Angular 7 into your project. Most of the time, for most projects that don't have anything advanced or that don't have any dependency to other frameworks and libraries, upgrading to Angular 7 is going to be very straightforward. You can just run ng update in Angular CLI, and pass 2 parameters to it. So ngupdate at Angular CLI and at Angular/core. And what this is going to do is update these 2 packages and go through all of your code and update everything that has to be updated in here. So ngupdate also takes care of that. You go through your code and rename files that would have to be renamed, for instance, or change some syntaxes that have changed between different versions. So there's no syntax change between Angular 6 and Angular 7, but there were a few between Angular 5 and Angular 6. And ngupdate did take care of that for the upgrade from 5 to 6. You would be able to use the Angular update guide and this ngupdate to take care of all of this automatically. And as a result, updating most applications to Angular 7 just takes 4 to 5 minutes maximum. And it's really just the time to run these commands, get the new dependencies installed, and then test your project to make sure that everything is all good. But it's really easy and pretty fast to do. So conclusion for this presentation, upgrading to Angular 7 is straightforward, and there are no breaking changes in that version of the framework. The process just takes a few minutes, so I would definitely recommend, if you're using Angular 4, 5, 6, consider upgrading to Angular 7 as soon as you can, because it's really going to be fairly straightforward, and you're going to get a lot of benefits out of it. And as a result, since Angular 6, now we have all of these partner launches that are in sync with the Angular framework. So if you want to benefit from Angular Material, Angular Console, the Angular CDK, and all of that, getting on board with Angular 7 is definitely the best way to go. So what we're going to do now is go through a Q&A. So if you have any questions for me, we're going to do that right now and take, so we have up to 18 minutes to go through the Q&A, which is great. So what we can do is, there is in GoToWebinar, there's this feature where you can raise your hand virtually in the user interface. And if you have a question for me, feel free to raise your hand, and then I'll unmute you so you can ask your question, and I'm going to answer that right away. So let's get started with the Q&A. And you can also use the questions section that we have in GoToWebinar. So I see one question that was asked in the questions section. Thanks for the presentation, clear, interesting, and to the point. As you mentioned budgets, I would like to know how to keep the vendor bundle size under control. So you can definitely apply these budgets to the vendor bundle. And the key to keep it under control is to use as little dependencies as you can in your project, which I know is not always easy, because it is tempting with so many different open source libraries available online to just say, oh, okay, I need a date picker, let's Google for one and use that library, and then we just do an npm install, and somehow we got 100 megabytes of extra code for just a simple date picker. So my advice would be, whenever you decide you decide about an external library to use, take a look at how big it is, how big the build for that library is, so that you'll get an idea of the impact on your application. Because that's the thing with open source code. Anybody can contribute to open source, and people have good intentions, but sometimes they don't realize that they are building a very big library that could be much smaller, and this has an impact on our code, on us when we actually use this library. So in order to limit the size of the vendor bundle, I would say use budgets to make sure that the build would fail if things get out of control. And then And then every time you decide on a new library to include, just check it, try to use it, see the impact on your build, and then use that as a decision criteria whether this library is a good option or not. And there are so many open source libraries these days that you'll end up finding one that is very good in terms of what you need, and that has also a pretty good size so that it doesn't impact your build output too much. So I see another question from Mansour. I'm going to unmute you if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes. Sorry, I'm the one who actually. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Once again, thank you for.
So yeah, I saw the hand was raised in the webinar, so that's why I gave you. But okay, no problem. My bad.
I did two things at the same time, so I apologize for that. Thank you again.
No problem. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for the answer too. Yeah, it was great.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So any other questions? Again, feel free to use the webinar UI to let me know if you have a question, and I'll be happy to answer. So I see another question that I want to cover in the question section, and it is, does the scroll bar remember the selected row when you scroll up and down? So that's a question regarding the Angular CDK. And yes, you can definitely have the scroll bar remember that, and you could store that info in using a state management library, for instance. And then be able to restore that that state whenever you get back to that page later on. So you can definitely do that and make the CDK remember what was the scroll bar position. That's a very good question. So let's see if we have other questions. Yeah, so another question, could you tell us what is the benefit of virtual scroll from a performance point of view? So the main benefit of virtual scroll is if you have a lot of data, let's say hundreds of thousands of records that you want to render on the screen, or that you want the user to be able to scroll through, then instead of having to download all of that data up front, so instead of having to download hundreds of thousands of records, then the virtual scrolling would just be able to download and fetch some of them, let's say 10 by 10 or 50 by 50, so that you're only getting small increments of that big data set. So from a performance perspective, that's a huge difference, because instead of downloading 100,000 records, you're going to be able to fetch them 50 by 50, which is going to be more efficient. And of course, you can tweak that to your needs. Maybe you're just going to fetch them 5 by 5 or 2 by 2. Or 10 by 10, 100 by 100. It really depends on what you're doing, but you have control over that, and it does help a lot in order to improve the performance of your app. Yes, that is for sure. Next question, for scroll, can you always keep the column bar on top? So yeah, with again, the CDK just gives us a couple of directives to deal with the scrolling, but you have full control over the way things look like. So you can, it is still your own HTML and your own CSS that is going to be used for that. What the CDK gives us is just a tooling to implement the virtual scroll. So you can control how things look like and what you want to do with that, and customize the styling and everything. CDK is just a layer of tooling on top of the Angular framework to implement these behaviors, really. But it doesn't decide how things should look like on, or even provide any rendering by default for such features. So I don't see any more question in the Q&A section. I do not see any hands raised. So a few things I want to mention is that if you want to access the slides for this presentation, the link is on the screen right now. So you can use that to get access to these slides, and the QR code as well on the screen would give you access to that. You have a Twitter handle here, and you also have my blog URL. So if you want to get access to my blog and subscribe to it, feel free to do so. And another thing I want to mention is that as a thank you for attending this webinar, Accelebrate does offer a $500 coupon that you can use when you book your next training session with them. So if you go to the Accelebrate website and contact Accelebrate for a training session, or if you call them, just mention the code Angular7 and say that you attended with this webinar, and they're going to give you a 500 coupon on your next training session, which is great. So just for attending this, you get to learn a few things, plus you get a $500 coupon. So thanks a lot to Accelebrate for doing this. So I see a question in the Q&A from Kelly, and she says that the URL doesn't work. So yeah, the case does matter. So in the case of the URL that you mentioned here, the M, the final letter, has to be uppercase. And that's probably why you cannot access it. So if you use it with the right case, M, the final letter M has to be uppercase, then that should solve the issue and you should be able to get access to my slides. Also, yeah, if you did use the capital M, then it would have to be blocked by your network config because the link, let me try it again. Yep, it does work for me. So it could be that Google Docs is blocked by your proxy. So maybe something you can try at home later today and get access to the slides when you can do so. And you can save them as a PDF document as well once you have access to those. All right, so I think that is it for today. Thanks a lot for attending the webinar. And if you have any questions later on, again, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or through my blog. I'm always open to questions. I'm always happy to help. And again, don't forget that Accelebrate has this coupon for you. So if you're thinking about booking some Angular training, that would be a good option as well. So thanks everyone for coming today, and yeah, again, feel free to use these resources and get back to me if you have any questions. Thanks a lot and have a great day.